I'm Stephen Henry Madoff. I'm the founding chair of the master's program in curatorial practice at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, a two-year master's program training young curators in every aspect of the profession. And one of the parts of the program is the part that I get to do, and I'm very happy about, which is the curatorial roundtable. Each week, we get to speak with a distinguished director or a curator from somewhere in the world. And it is my friend Daphne today, and I'm very happy to have Daphne with us. So I'm going to read a short bio, and then I'm going to hand it over to Daphne. Daphne will have about 50 minutes for a presentation, and then at the bottom of your screen is the Q&A, and that's where you can make a comment, ask a question of Daphne, and we'll have 10 minutes or so for that. So I will begin by introducing Daphne, saying currently working between New York and Berlin as curator at large for Performa. Daphne IS has previously served as a director, co-director, curator, and advisor to several cultural institutions and research initiatives, including Kunstinstitut Meli, formerly known as Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art, from 2012 to 2017, Art Hub Asia, the New Museum, and VAC Foundation. At Performa, Daphne recently presented Protest and Performance, A Way of Life with Kathy Noble. That was in 2023. She also co-organized Sonic Tonic Assembly with Publix. She co-curated the 13th Gwangju Biennale with Natasha Ginwala in 2021, the 6th Moscow Biennial in 2015, and the 11th Baltic Triennial in 2012. Daphne is a founding curator of Blind Dates, and I know you're going to mention Neri, who was with her in founding it. And Blind Dates addresses, just to say a word about it, addresses the traces of the peoples, places, and cultures that once constituted the diverse geography of the Ottoman Empire. Daphne's last curatorial endeavor, Sarkis 7 Days, 7 Nights, was on view at Kunsthalle Baden-Baden until February 2024. And with that, Daphne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, for engaging me and inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with SVA audiences, students, but I also see there are friends in the audience, colleagues I haven't been in touch with maybe for 20 years. This year is my 20th year that I've been in the art world as an active player. So it's also a chance to always look at what I've done, to also reflect what I've done. Sometimes we follow our instincts, curatorial instincts, running amok with the zeitgeist, not really knowing but intuiting on a daily basis how we're actually developing the projects. And it's a nice chance to also revisit whatever I've done with you. The homework for today was actually the question, how do we navigate the times and the context we operate in? Stephen kindly asked me to provide a reflection on my work with a focus, especially on artists and curators can be the ultimate collaborators in the co-creation for future vectors, future directions, not only for the future of institutions and their representation, but also politics, and in some cases, for countries as well. So it's quite a ambitious a way of thinking about how artists can make an impact in the way a country perceives itself, in the way Ai Weiwei, for instance, works with the volatility of mainland China, or used to work at least at the times when it was possible to really play with that volatility and sculpting that perception within his capacity as an artist and an activist. For me, I think my work in the past maybe 20 years, a lot of people have seen my work in the biennial context, where I was able to experiment a lot, and that I appreciate a lot what the biennials offer us in terms of dealing with the last 10 years, 20 years, and inviting artists to engage through their humanist vision to create engagement. For instance, I could easily talk today about some of the biennials I've engaged with, but I want to actually quickly go through 63 slides in the 55 minutes you have given me and interweave through them very quickly to see what's really emerging out of that. I wanted to mention the Baltic Triennial. Simply, it was a wonderful way of actually engaging with inviting two artists, Michael Portner and Kira Nova, to collaborate with me to create a vision for the triennial in which, instead of using a white cube, we used the empty vessel of an actor. So we hired an actor through which the entire triennial was pushed through. And that can only happen if you have a very small budget that you need to reinvent. In this case, it was about 70,000 euro budget for a triennial. Imagine what that is. And we basically pushed the entire instructions of variety of artists through the human vessel, through this actor. Sometimes he expanded in collective groups. Sometimes he was on his own over 10 days. And at night, he would fall asleep and have his dreams and nightmares, which would manifest themselves on stage through charismateria, with artists, through the vessel of artists like Ragnar Kriartosyan or Alexander Bachcheches or Meet Warlow or Ivo Dimchev. So the idea was be experimental to the extent one, be, refuse the white cube and really engage with the live medium, working with artists who have that elusive X factor and have them manifest what art of the moment it actually is. The recent Biennale endeavor I've undertaken was with Natasha Jinwala, Minds Rising, Spirits Tuning. And this was undertaking at the height of the pandemic. And this is where we actually search for a dialectical understanding between organic and inorganic intelligence. We were inspired very much by Catherine Malabou's work around the plasticity of the brain and what it means for mutual aid futures, collective futures, as well as anarchic futures. And some of the topics we looked at was not only ancestral knowledge systems and matriarchal world building ecologies in Korea and the rest as it ties to Korea, but also work with artists like Ato here, who work with the collective cyborg, who worked with swarm intelligence, who worked with adaptive resilience in the way we are haptically co-evolving with artificial intelligence. So the idea was, rather than resisting, how do we co-evolve, learning from martial arts, Systema, Buto, body sculpting techniques, haptically, what does the body have to remember from its inherent knowledge, and then bring it about so we can actually find ways beyond resistance, but co-evolving in a way that, also makes us remember things that we have forgotten about, what's inside the human. A lot of the discussions we brought about also, of course, it was in the proposals phase. What is foreign in us? What benefits us? What can we learn from microorganisms, bacterial organisms, and all that somehow got eclipsed with the pandemic breaking out, which made it even more exciting. We were able to work with artists like Anna Maria Milan, and who went into the feminism discussions in Korea, vis-a-vis LARPing, vis-a-vis online video gaming ecologies. We work with John Gerard, who looked at the ecological precarity through neural networks. We work with Lynn Hirschman-Layson, who continued her Water Woman series by looking at again, I think that was a collaboration with the biogenetically inspired engineering department of Harvard, where she was developing, where they were developing some bacteria that could actually work in the cleaning of the waters. And she created this whole scientific endeavor as an extension of her work since the 70s. The reason I bring this all about is how artists were the collaborators to make a biennial as such to happen is, during the pandemic, we had to hold all together. One person was losing a loved one, another person was losing their studio, another person was out of a job. At home, feminism was collapsing for me. And it was this complete, shifting time where we actually, as artists and co-curators, artistic directors, had to hold the vessel together and really give birth to something that could also be planted in the minds of the people, rather than make it only visitable and consumable over one, visit. So the idea was also, when you mobilize it online, when you actually, how do you plant a biennial in the minds of people and create a cultural imaginary or a story that is, that is at least felt in different registers, rather than just visit and see the exhibition. Maybe I'll show a little bit, since I have more time than I thought. The the film is a small snippet of how the biennial actually eventually became a television broadcast studio, where we actually created the whole procession just for the television purposes, rather than the actual funeral we wanted to give to the biennial, which was not possible due to the pandemic. And the song that was provided was by a Sami musician from the very north, Katarina Baruch, the deep voice, and that was a homage to the matriarchal lineage of hers. So I think the lyrics of the song relates to many of our regions. It doesn't have to be only the very, very global north that has been very much abundant. Today I wanted to really highlight a project that is really dear to my heart, that doesn't get much attention. Simply the website died, simply because it took place 15 years ago. Simply my dear collaborator, co-curator is no longer with us. Niri Melkonyan, who's also, it is her birthday today, so it was important for me to remember her and mention her name. As a scholar and a curator, she's been very much committed to the diasporic knowledge systems herself. Today is also the anniversary of the Armenian genocide, and she, being of Armenian lineage, being born on this day, have been really committed to the field. And lucky me that I also was able to come together with her to develop this project called the Blind Dates, which started in 2015, which got punctuated with an exhibition in 2010. And it actually continued a bit longer than what I'm going to tell you here. But the reason why I also wanted to say is how much we are dependent on artists as curators to develop a language for a region where the language is very much, calcified in very rigid academic zones. So the criticality, the forgotten voices, the forgotten histories, especially when you think about the Greek diaspora or the Armenian diaspora, like in the context of the United States, you really see the history of the white, the book, which I'm sure most of you have read, the whitening of the diaspora, how long it took time, or it's even taking time, and maybe by choice, it isn't even going for the whitening of where the diasporic language really fell through the cracks in many ways. And it was really important for us to figure out how we can create a language. It wasn't only the Armenian genocide that was driving this project. It was more really between the scholars and the artists and non-artists, can we create a platform with no money, with no income, with no, anybody putting the seed funding whatsoever. So it really started over dinner conversations. It started with small interviews, tea parties. It was in Austin, maybe in Yerevan, in Istanbul, in New York, in Brooklyn, in Connecticut, in different places, over dinner parties. And the reason I share it with the curatorial school here is also like, not everything has to be so funded from the outset onwards. The way organically projects can also evolve, as long as the intention is set that we want to determine a platform and create something out of it. And this is a project that I keep revisiting in my heart. Often I want to continue it in some capacity when I have another opportunity. It's becoming even more relevant. And the way it worked out, here is Dear Neri, here is Aram Jibilian's work as he was revisiting the ghosts of the legacy of Arshil Gorky as he ended his life in Connecticut. The way we've done it eventually was basically pairing artists with artists or artists with non-artists. So in the case of Ahmet Öğüt and Nina Kachadurian, they came together. They haven't really known each other, and they made a lifetime commitment to exchange the letters in their names with a notary, Ah from Ahmet and Ha from Kachadurian. And they created a legalized transaction that they are now committed to each other and bound to each other for the rest of their lives because they exchanged their letters. This is a very conceptual project. In the case of Israeli artist Michael Bloom coming together with a Bosnian artist, Damir Nakšić, they created this black and white comedy where the geopolitics is really sort of keeps playing out. The divide between the East and West kind of, perpetuates itself through the very comic ruptures on an ongoing basis. It's a hilarious film they produced. There are many projects that were involved. We had 13 marriages, 1 divorce from all the pairing exercise. We had Jalal Tufik, we had Elif Uras, we had Hakan Topal, Zurban.net, who did a whole botanical survey of the region. And when I say former Ottoman Empire, for those who are not familiar, of course, it's like, the former Ottoman is from the Black Sea to Egypt, North Africa, to where is now Saudi Arabia and Palestine, to Libya, to Tunisia, all the way to Hungary. It's a whole area of a colonial legacy with its variations, of course, what that coloniality means. In every experience, a bit different. Let's say the Greek is much more different than the Armenian experience, or the consequences, the violent reformations that happened with the abrupt rupture of the Ottoman Empire, the consequences that are still lingering, their effects today in Israel, in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, whatnot. So the idea was born also through a blind date she and I had, and as part of Performa, when I had invited Melik Ohanyan to do a performance with us, and that took place at Governor's Island. And we didn't announce at the time. Governor's Island was not, was just at the very beginning of opening itself the way it's been so successfully now active. And it was just a walk. It was just a moment as an event as conceived by Melik, where the human exchange was everything and nothing else was mattered. It was the power of conversations that he instilled. So there were many people who participated. They didn't even know where they are coming to. They just trusted the artists and the way we've invited them, took a ferry, came. And it was this very beautiful cinematic unfoldings that happened also with the weather, with the conversations, with emanations that happened. So, and that's also the moment where she and we met, and that inspiration also gave us the impetus, okay, we can actually take this as a cue and develop something together. The reason I mentioned Performa is it's an organization that I've been involved since its inception, founded by art historian Rosalie Goldberg, a dedicated organization that has really looked at the history of performance in 20th century, but also commissioning artists to look at, 21st century we have to engage with 21st century. We keep forgetting in the Cold War Renaissance that we're still in 20th century, but basically shaping a new understanding what performance can do, sometimes highly produced, staged presentations, sometimes a very inventive use of the city as a grid, sometimes very conceptual gestures. But so far the institution has commissioned, 800 productions, has worked, more than 3,000 artists over its 20 years. And in a way I bring it about because the volatility of the region where I come from, I'm raised in Istanbul, and it really shaped also my curatorial practice in a way. I believe the region has also shaped the history of 20th century. So as Performa, when we look at the futurists, for instance, who produced their Futurist Manifesto in 1907, we look at Marinetti. He was raised in Egypt. We looked at Valentin Saint-Juan. She was hanging out in Syria at the time with the Druze and writing her Last of Manifesto. Marinetti himself was a war journalist at the border of Greece and Turkey at the time, or the cross section is Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And he was so astounded and so impressed with the sounds of war that he started doing, playing with all the graphic layouts for his books. He created the famous Intono Mori, which was completely, taking its cues from the war that he experienced, which was the Balkan War at the time in 1912. So in a way, the 20th century, sort of the idea of war and destruction and let's get away with all the museums and let's destroy them type of manifestos that have been written and published in Figaro had their cues also from the Levant, from the Mesopotamia. Performa is an organization I keep being involved with, and there has been, as I said, many commissioned pieces, and the archive is very rich and is a reference point. I think would be great for the students to also look there with keywords and whatnot, whatever their research is, they can go in. Stephen and I were also considering of ways of, making it a bit more relevant, how humanities can actually can be influenced by the history of performance and how performance can change the way humanities is being taught in schools. So fast forward, last year, I was able to go back to the Levant, to the Mesopotamia, to the former Ottoman Empire. And because of the woman life freedom movement, Jinjiyat Azadi in Iran, with the board member of Performa, Shirin Neshat, and with the senior curator, Kathy Noble, I was in conversation to develop this program called Performance and Protest, A Way of Life. Because it took its cues from Iran and with the Kurdish minorities and the Baha'i minorities and their rebellion to the system, it was very much important for us to look at the feminist legacies in the region, whether it's in Iran or in Lebanon. And we have invited we've basically created 8 evenings that really nuanced the region, being eclipsed also with October 7 and us presenting it in November, period when Performa takes place, took a whole another dimension because all of a sudden our program, Performance and Protest, A Way of Life, was the place where the community got together every night, 300 people coming together and really discussing what's happening in the city, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in the world. And it's the first project where I got 0 press, which was really interesting, which I really enjoyed. I should disclose that as well, because I think the fact that the community of artists and system thinkers and activists were coming together every night and responding and moving and creating this nuancing space was highly, highly crucial and important. We had Pamela Sneed and Greg Bordowitz, who basically presented their a tragic comedy in a town hall style meeting where they invited also, obviously Greg coming also from AIDS activism, and then with Pamela bringing a whole like Black feminist perspective, them presenting how health space and activism is coming together and is also meeting the point of where the taxes are going by the US. So basically, art activism met the health space through an understanding of the AIDS activism continuing with COVID and how it's getting eclipsed with what's happening in Palestine. The tragicomedy was called Healthcare, Not Warfare. It was the first presentation of an ongoing activism platform they are actually setting up. We have invited Rabih Mroueh, who brought a whole new take on what happened in Lebanon. And of course, when you think of Lebanon with the queer feminist movement there that got shut down, how they are feeling about Hezbollah and how they are, as a result, feeling about Hamas and how they are in their position vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. Those nuanced understandings came through this lecture performance he has enabled remotely. We had Rana Hamadeh, who re-invoked her Shiite ritual, Ashura, the Shiite tradition of Ashura, which is the reimagining, restaging of Prophet Ali's murder in, not Prophet Ali, Hussein's murder in Karbala, and how that ritual, that invocation is now hijacked by Hezbollah, and how that spiritual rebellious energy is now hijacked by actually forces that are not in the hands of the queer feminist movement. We had an artist, Göksu Kunak, that you see here. She looked at the tactics of camouflage and as a tool for protests and subterfuge. She coming as a queer artist from a highly conservative family where she was expected to veil and really reacting to it while using camouflage also as a tool. Using the body, her body also as a site for transformation and liberation, this animal-like mutation that she went after. So it was a very precious First Amendment zone where you could actually see it wasn't this bipolarity of, I'm on this side or I'm on this side, but more actually the nuanced spaces in Iran, in Lebanon, in Turkey, and also in the New York activism scene. I'm going to do a back now 20 years back, because everything that I've been doing, my first taste of working with art vis-a-vis political processes came about when I joined a curatorial crash course at the Apple, and that was a 7-month curatorial dipping exercise into the European art ecology. I mention it because it could be inspiring for the students here. I also mention it. It's the first time I saw how art, when it eclipsed with the headlines, can have such a big impact on the local context. Again, artists as co-creators, curators as collaborators to create directions for a sense of country's history and legacy. This is 2005. The context is the restitution, the Nazi restitution, which we now take for granted, with the Hairs claiming their Kandinskys, and Matisse is now is almost standardized practice, to the point that it actually is probably more working for the lawyers than the Hairs themselves. But at the time, the Hautsticker, the dealer's restitution case was still in the air. And as a participant in the curatorial program, when the director, Saskia Boss, had left and the new incoming director was not there, it was this wonderful limbo phase where I could actually work with a very potent story that came to me randomly as I was walking on the street. I met this guy who said he used to own the building of the Apple. He only sold it to the next owner. He sold it, but he didn't want this story to be known. And the next owner rented it to an art space called the Apple on the condition that the story would never come out. The rental was €1 a year. So it was quite an enticing way to keep actually the story a secret and not divulge it. But when I was in this vacuum area and when I found out what the story about the building is, it was a Nazi looting institution. It was a bank at the site of the Apple building that actually was working for the Jewish community with the name Lippmann Rosenthal and Co. And after the Nazis took over, it continued to working under the same moniker, completely fooling the community as if it is business as usual, whereas actually it became a tool for the community to be identified, for all their artworks and their bonds and their silver to be identified, and it led the pathway for the Jewish community to end up in Auschwitz. So it had such strong ties, the institution, the Nazi looting institution, to an auction house that sold all the works, all the artworks of the Jewish community to an auction house that became then purchased by Sotheby's. The collection, some of the collection of artworks were sitting and are still sitting in the ABN AMRO collection. A lot of the documentary materials, a lot of the identity cards are with the Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies, and a lot of the documentation is with the Imperial Library, or maybe it's not called the Royal Library in The Hague. So for me, and Harry Molish, who's a very well-known Dutch author, his father was the director of the Nazi looting institution, and the Jewish bank's manager was in a clandestine gay relationship with the Rijksmuseum director at the time. In a small country like Holland, where 16 million people live, and at the time probably it was less, a story like that and the web of relationships that the institution's history can bring about was very intense. For this, I invited an artist who was trained in history, Michael Bloom, who I got to know thanks to the Istanbul Biennial that Vasif Kortun and Charles Esch staged in 2005, to work with me on the project. And he immediately took it on and he recreated the bank. He worked with psychics, he worked with historians to really restage the entire bank in half of the building. My co-curators also agreed that I could take the half of the building, and it became headlines in the newspapers. It became a very strong force in the discussion of the restitution to be really discussed. The placard that the artist Michael Bloom put outside became a reason many old people started walking into the building and telling us their stories vis-a-vis the bank, thinking the bank is still alive. And this is the first time 20 years or 19 years ago that I really saw, okay, it matters how art and history can come together and how it mobilizes the discussion. The exhibition was called Mercury in Retrograde. I think there has been at least 3-4 exhibitions with the same name. We had a Wikipedia-based website at the time, which is still around, I believe, that survived the times. But Mercury in Retrograde was not only a reference of the astrological condition, but also a way to revisit the histories that have not been told. And my colleague, an artist curator, Stefan Russo, also went after a colonial history, the notion that the Dutch are the ever explorers, and debunking it with this failed expedition that took place in 16th century. The expedition story was used to actually reignite this sense of the Dutch in their denazification periods as a way to tell them they're actually explorers, they're actually so inventive. And actually turns out it was a failed expedition where the explorer in Nova Zembla never made it to the end, but he had a great historian that made it look like it was the ultimate expedition. I share this with New York audiences because New York is also having the 400th anniversary of the Dutch. It's kind of a nice interjection in that space. And this is how Stefan actually intervened as an artist curator, getting the loans from the Rijksmuseum, getting all the expedition tools and working with it in parallel to the project that I was bringing about. Fast forward years after, living in China, after my Amsterdam years, I came back to Rotterdam to run the institution, now called MELI. At the time, it was called Witte de Wit. And after working there for 5 years with the agenda to create an extremely diverse program, in my last year, I also invited an artist by the name of Wendelin van Oldenburg and her project with Lucy Cotter, Cinema Hollanda, to have a local manifestation in Rotterdam. by which I mean they were invited to represent Holland in Venice Biennial. Sometimes it's easy to talk about representation abroad, but when you actually represent some of the dynamics locally, it creates knots, or it creates some hotspots and minds that have not been addressed locally. I had one floor of the building available, and I invited Wendelin, and I said, if you want to actually bring what you're doing in Venice, also bring it to the institution, carte blanche, bring all the artists and activists that you have worked with in all your films that looked at the colonial legacy of the country, of the Netherlands, in Brazil, in Indonesia, and let's have an exhibition, a collaborative exhibition. And that actually was a very dynamic platform, which raised questions about the name of the institution. Witte de With was a sanitized name from the colonial times. The name was after a colonial admiral. We knew this all along. The institution has had many, many directors and chapters where post-colonial discussions have taken place. For me, coming from Istanbul, I was always a bit irritated by the fact that there was a military name, because we have the experience of more the military coups. But this question coming from the activists who contributed to the project, not from inside, but from outside, and raising the question, and this question being deliberated over a whole summer internally through the program of Wendelin and her guests, made me and my board come to the decision and to announce that we have to make a change to the name. And we, of course, did a lot of research how the name came about. We talked about how to call it still Witte de With, with or without. We had names. Do we strike it through? Do we kill it? Do we remove it? Do we change it overnight? And there were many propositions, but at the end, it was the end of my tenure, and the decision was, let's announce that we're going to make a change to the name and leave it open for discussion for 3 months until the end of my tenure, where we're going to hear all sides, because some people who are on the street, which is also named after Witte de With, were thinking this cannot change, it's our legacy, and some people were saying it has to change because it's hurting to people of color who are who have experienced the colonial legacy of this country in many ways. And the reason I share this with you, leaving it open and fragile, is something that it's a very fragile act. It's a very vulnerable act. And my successor, Sofia Hernandez Chong Choi, who came 3 months after I left, she made the whole changing to the name a case study, where she committed 4 or 5 years to really explore what it means to change, not only change the name, but also change, other aspects of the institution in terms of the locality and so forth. So she made it even a 5-year study. But the reason I'm sharing it again with you, what a powerful way of actually making change to an institution, when the institution took the bullet for all the whiteness of institutions in the country, not because it was, it had a phenomenal program that was very much invested in diversity, but that doesn't really matter at the end. It took the bullet for the whiteness of institutions and created a big cultural debate in the country. We got trolled, and it became a national election item. In 24 hours, the right-wing party in Rotterdam started asking for subsidy cuts and so forth. So it was a very, very intense time, not only for the artists, for the institution, for the staff, but also for the country, where the debate kept continuing. And afterwards, and this is at the same time when, of course, Black Lives Matter is taking place, when Charlottesville happened at the UVA campus with all the supremacist processions that took place. So in a way, how Netherlands was very much close to what was happening in the US politics was also important to notice. Not everything happens because of one project. There's always another project that led to it. And the reason I share this with you is because, nobody is a hero. The change doesn't happen overnight. It's always a process. It's always a journey. One of the reasons why we could come to the point, maybe I'll skip this. This was a parallel project that was taking place with Wendelin's project with Goshka Masuga and Ahmet Öğüt, looking at destruction, looking at monuments, looking at how artists can work with destruction, perceived instability as a creative medium. There's lots of scratching, a lot of burning, destruction can be in a way going back to the futurist agendas, but in a very different way. And they were looking at the affinities between their work. But the reason why I wanted to bring the journey aspect of not only for the institutional memory, but we're sort of always our own ancestors with everything we do. As artists, it's so important to keep the artist-to-artist conversations going, curator-artist, curator-curator conversations, to know how we're continuing the journey, the conversation in the field. One project I want to mention that I believe led to many ways to my invitation also to Wendelin was the project No Humans Involved by How Do You Say Yam in African, a collective I invited together with curatorial a fellow at the time that I had invited, Nana Podusei Soke. She's actually teaching at Bard at the moment. And How Do You Say Yam African was a collective that actually left or had to leave the Whitney Biennial at the time. So for me, it was important to actually invite them and to work with them and to see how a very Pan-African collective with a very different aesthetic sensibility than the institution Witte de Wit at the time could come, reside in Rotterdam, work with the dynamics, because the Anglo-Saxon narrative around racial politics and race is very different than the experience of the Dutch Suriname, more the Afro-Caribbean experience. So for me, it was also important. This is, 2 years before Wendelin's project came about. And their engagement with the city, with the ontology, what constitutes of human, the way they engage with poetry and hip hop and music in the institution. So for me, this was actually a shifting point for the institution also, to see how overnight, again, it's a long process for the collective to come to this point and to work, but how the institution could really change overnight and bring different aesthetic sensibilities and intersectional sensibilities to the institution. And I will end with, let's see, how many more minutes do I have? I think I have 10 more minutes. I will end with Sarkis, a beloved artist, collaborator of mine, a master. He is in his late 80s, from Istanbul, Armenian origin, lives in Paris, and has been a very important artist in the sense that he brought the terms like light shots, creek shots, how the art history is filled with histories of looting and pain, and how it's the artist's job to actually work with memory as a journey, never let it stagnate, always continue the discussion, always bringing openings and breath to that notion of memory has been really his commitment space. He's done it through his sculptures, his constellation of images. He's done it through his neon. I mean, he is one of the first artists to actually work with neon installations. And for me, to be invited by him to collaborate on the Pavilion of Turkey in 2015 was a big honor. It was the 100th year anniversary of the Armenian genocide, the year of 2015. And for him to be able to take the burden of the country and to work with the notion of representation was a very heavy exercise. This is also a time when the government in Turkey was considering some sort of reconciliation. There was a bit of this dialogue spheres, of course, for many, dialogue is not even an option, like ultimate acknowledgement and repair is the goal. But this is a time, to give the context, was a time for a bit more dialogue between also Armenia and Turkey at the time. So Sarkis has invited me to work with him. And he created a magnificent installation that had a lot of references to the various histories of Armenian architecture and his personal biography, but also some of the key players in the landscape of forgotten, amnesia-ridden historiography of Turkey. He created this representation space, which is magic in the 56th Venice Biennial, which was at the time run by Okui and Zevor. But what happened is, on the day of the anniversary of the genocide, which is also today, we got the news from the government of the Turkish government that the use of the word of genocide by the widow of an Armenian journalist who was murdered, Hrant Dink, was not allowed to be used, and therefore our publication would not be available for circulation. And therefore, if we continue to circulate it, it would remove us from the right to call the pavilion of Turkey, even though the pavilion was 100% privately funded. The right to use the flag actually belonged to the government. It's a diplomatic space, we found out, which we should have probably known before. Do you still hear me? Because I think my headphones are dying. What Sarkis has done was take all the books and turn them into a treasure box. I call it a coffin. He gets upset to me when I use the word, but basically he turned them, he gilded them with gold, and he basically put them all into a row inside this this casket in this box, and he immediately put it under the rainbow that he had actually installed as part of this installation. So the censorship overnight also became part of the pain that continues, that memory is continuing. Recently, I just closed an exhibition with him at Kunsthalle Baden-Baden, where the directors there, Adnan Yıldız and Çağla İlk, had invited me to work with them, to do an exhibition with him again. And this was really part of his healing process, because the fact that he took it on, but then he got censored, the publication got censored, and the way he had to transform it, and the way the news sort of wasn't given to the headlines first, but it was a delayed sort of, the way the consequences of what happened with the pavilion had long lingering effects, not only on him, but also to me. And working with him again for an exhibition recently, he really went into this healing space, the psychoanalytical space that he shared with a psychoanalyst who was a Holocaust survivor at the time. And he shared not only his works from his rich arsenal of, his entire oeuvre of his different periods of his life in this exhibition that we curated, but he also shared with us the sleeping bag in which he slept every night during his psychoanalytical journey, where he was really trying to exercise out what he went through, not only his entire life, but also since this pavilion onwards, what he went through as he was sharing it with his psychoanalysts. And the artworks he produced in response to this was part of this big theater that we put out in this exhibition space at Kunsthalle Baden-Baden. And I will wrap it up here. I think we're good with time, 4 minutes early. I want to thank you for your patience, for listening to all these variety of case studies. But at the end of the day, you can see some of my curatorial instincts, but also the motivational fire that's in me, what drives me as a curator in the field, in the way I work with historical processes, in the way I work with political processes, not always intentionally. Sometimes they also emerge out of the blue, or sometimes a project just lands out of the blue. So I also see myself a little bit like that vessel, the actor that was in the Baltic Triennial that I worked with Mindaugas. So I will thank you Stephen, again for the
Yes.
invitation. And I
Yes,
hope we have enough audiences still to continue.
we have a great audience. And I had written, now's the time to post your comment or question.
Mhm.
And I'm only seeing not really questions, just nice things to say to you, except from one person saying, ironically, today also being the anniversary of the Armenian genocide.
Yep.
Is there anyone who would like to type something, post something now? Let's give it a moment. And if not, definitely we'll just go over to the session with the students. But let's see if anybody wants to write something. Okay, let's see. What challenges you faced when collaborating with artists?
The challenges of collaborating with artists,
Around boundaries related to permissibility.
case by case. I mean, I think the working in China and really directly engaging with the censorship ecology there, when I work with the municipality there, when I work with NYU in Shanghai also as an adjunct, working with the students and their exhibitions, but also commissioning artists to do live pieces and presenting, observing exhibitions, dealing with the censorship police in different ways. Like I got a different tooling, sensing. Also my work a little bit in Moscow was very helpful. The dynamics of Kremlinology, which is also something that shaped me in my upbringing in Turkey. Like never believe the headlines, always look to the backstage, always look to the back. So whenever I'm collaborating with artists, like for us, it's so important to understand the complex historiography, the complexity, and be really open about it from the out, from the very beginning onwards. Because I'm also trained in political science and foreign affairs, I don't come to the art world with an art history training. And therefore, for me, maybe the geopolitical formations, the sort of the violence of the nation state, reformations around them, like they're always the guiding sort of tonality, the contextual waves within which I go on a journey with the artist. So it's always starting out with that. So maybe it's also my lack of I want to say fear, but fear is not the right word, but maybe my intention to be able to sit in the pain a bit longer than a regular art world transaction together with the artist. Um, it helps. And also having these platforms have been a luxury, and I think those platforms are not there for a long time. The roof has blown off, maybe blown off 10 years ago, but we're still riding in this intellectual space that is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And that space afforded and me able to work with them in a timely manner, that was also helpful, that I could also be with artists who wanted to be more transgressive, um, with their profound vision of the world. Um, but at the end of the day, I mean, it's their vision that matters more than my vision, right? So it's more, how do you lay it out so they can actually go in that space with their full potential and energy, um, in the best way possible.
All right, so there are a couple of other comments. Let's see, let me scroll up. Okay, so someone is asking you about the UK. In the UK, censorship is coming our way fast and furious. Would you curate here in the UK?
I mean, it's I think every situation is different. Every country has its own dynamics, right? I mean, some things that we were able to do 5 years ago, we're not able to do today. Some artists that we worked with, or my, colleagues have worked with some of the writers are not workable anymore. Like the landscape shifts, the perception of art shifts now. Like it used to be every 10 years, the perception, the history of that object would change. Now it's almost feels every 3 months, every 6 months, the pace of the perception is shifting so gradually. So sure, like, I mean, on an ideal level, every country has its own complex reality that needs to be dealt with. Like history is important, but also the conditions, what's allowed, what's not, how much experimentation is allowed, how much the beast has expectations, how do you maneuver the beast? There's certain expectations with a lot of the biennial spaces. Also, there's, you know, how do you tap into the protest energies while creating a spectacle which is antithetical to what the protest energies are? And then how do you do it via contemporary art, which is by default non-consensual? How do you create that balance without compromising the integrity of what you want to say, or, you know, what your artists want to bring about? So it's always a bit of a conducting business. And recently I actually was placed in an interview with a conductor in England, surprisingly, who left because of funding cuts, and he was boycotting it, a big name. And the way he was describing his exercise and the way I was perceiving what curating is was not really too far away. So in a way, it's a bit of a conducting exercise based on wherever we are going. I mean, but at the end of the day, most of the times we're of course guests, and then you have to also work with the ironies of being a guest, or the boldness that comes with the being a guest. In each context, it's a bit different.
Okay. Another anonymous question. Thanks for your talk. How did you handle the censorship threat regarding the Turkish flag on your publication?
There is two versions of the publication, one with the flag and one without. The ones with the flag are part of the artwork of Sarkis. The ones without the flag are eternally for circulation online since the opening of the pavilion. So it can be accessed online on isu.com. If you look at Respiro, you can actually find the link there. It was a discussion of whether the headlines should be fed or not. And it was the impression of the artist that all the work that he has undertaken should not be given away overnight for one headline that would actually kill the project. So, so he wanted to find a nuanced way of working with this situation. In retrospective, now I'm thinking about it, maybe we should have really made it news, but the news eventually came out anyway. And it's still that it is still a word that is untouchable by the Turkish state. It's like the only word that cannot be stated by the Turkish state, simply because it has restitution and repair consequences. I mean, the government of Turkey would lose the airport of Ankara even if they engage into this discussion around the genocide. And then with the word genocide, which was used by the widow of a journalist who was murdered, who was so dear to our hearts. And the way she used it was actually for the purposes to describe the pain of her people, and comparing it almost to the pain of Jesus in her text, was also taken out of the context. Regardless, the freedom to use the word should be available to all. And the word should not also stagnate. Any debates should not stagnate the idea that memory, you know, should be a journey, should be a continuous conversation, is also something that I always keep in mind vis-a-vis the word genocide, because there's something about it that is important to use, important to acknowledge, but there's something about it that also blocks the conversation. And for me, it matters that the conversation also continues publicly and privately.
So I think that's it. Stephanie Korab wants to be in touch with you. She's in Lebanon and she's saying she'd like to communicate with you later. So we can arrange that. So
Sure. Mhm.
okay, Daphne, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. I should say that next week is the last week for the Curatorial Roundtable this academic year. We'll have Christine Ayin with us, who is the research curator at Tate Liverpool. So join us then, and thank you for being with us. And Daphne, we'll see you on the other link in a minute. All right.
Thank you again. Bye.
Thanks to everyone. Bye.